to scrutinise this government.
I call the honourable member Holly Walker. Denise. I'm sorry, Denise Roach. I'll get it right.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to oppose this bill, and the Green Party will be opposing this bill because although, as my colleagues on this side of the House have already explained, there are some good parts in it. On the whole, we see this as part of the national government's better public services with less resources agenda rather than just better public services. The changes that this bill is promoting stem from the Better Public Services Advisory Group that reported back in March. And they did report back some very good things, which this bill does take up. And those are some of the provisions around the whole of government approach, which should reduce duplication. For example, chief executives of departments will have to think about wider interests of government in their work, and budget appropriations may be based around an overarching purpose rather than focused on particular departments or silos. But overall, this bill represents a challenge to the employment rights of public servants. And together with the changes that this government plans to make to the Employment Relations Act and the introduction of youth rates, it forms part of an orchestrated attack on all workers. There's no fundamental change to the model that was put in place in 1988. And there are changes tucked into this bill that will undermine state sector workers' employment rights and ease the path to privatisation. And I think that's one of the serious consequences of this bill, is that public funded services, public money, may go to the private sector without greater public benefit. If you look at, for example, at the provisions around technical redundancies, under this measure, employees who receive a redundancy notice and are offered an alternative position within the state sector, and the state sector is very wide, spanning from schools to hospitals to Housing New Zealand and every other agency in between. If they get a job in one of those agencies, then they're not entitled to redundancy compensation. The mere offer of a job anywhere would not entitle them to redundancy. And this measure is a reaction against a few very high-profile cases where senior executives got really big payouts. But this measure will lead to gaming of the system. It will push people into contracting. It will lead to more of that contracting culture that has become so prevalent in the public service where millions are spent on consultants. And anyway, it also presumes there are jobs to go to. Like many parts of this bill, this provision is using a sledgehammer to crack a nut. A better solution would be to ensure that if an employee is made redundant, that the employer makes every effort to find them alternative employment. And if not, then they're granted redundancy. The government also wants to dictate to employers in the state sector through orders and council that they can agree about what they can agree to before collective bargaining takes place. And this point has already been made by some of the speakers on this side of the House. It gives the government the right to set pay and condition expectations, and it gives that a legal status that they don't currently have. By issuing the government's expectations for pay and employment conditions in the state sector as an order in council, the government will be able to set the bargaining landscape and undermine collective bargaining right across the state sector. In effect, it's a wage freeze without actually calling it a wage freeze. And it undermines the whole concept of bargaining in good faith. This bill also gives chief executives of departments the authority to delegate statutory functions to non-government providers. Chief executives will be able to delegate statutory functions and powers between agencies and even to non-governmental service providers. All that would be required is ministerial approval. This is a groundbreaking piece of legislation. It's never been done before. It removes the very clear boundaries between what is clearly the statutory role of the states and what can be delegated to not-for-profit organisations or non-government organisations. Privatisation of these functions will be easier. Privatisation will be easier. Some jobs in the state sector have special powers that must be used with great care. They might include, for example, the power to search private property or to detain members of the public. Those are some of the statutory powers that could be delegated to the private sector. Is that what we want? Private police forces? In the DHB sector, for example, those statutory functions include people working in mental health who have the power to section people. Non-government organisations should be concerned about those fishhooks, those special powers, because they don't necessarily come with more funding. And community sector providers may have to take on coercive responsibilities that could undermine their relationship and the trust that they currently have in their communities and with their clients. The public should be concerned about the dangers of devolving the powers of the state. For example, enforcement, coercion, child protection, and what sort of effect that can have on vulnerable people. How will that impact on our communities? This bill overall is not a good thing for New Zealand. We are currently seeing a drop in the amount of public services, not better public services, we're talking less public services for the citizens of New Zealand. We are currently seeing the reduction in jobs, and there have been over 7,000 job losses. Over 7,000 job losses according to the Public Service Association over the last 4 years, and this was despite a promise by this government that they would cap numbers. They've gone well beyond that now. In Napier, for example, over the last 4 years, in a radius of 18 kilometres, there was a loss of over 200 public service jobs. Think, what does that do to a local economy? The tragedy of Pike River was a terrible thing, but it's unleashed a chorus of voices from across the political spectrum who are saying it's time for a rethink. And it definitely is a time for a rethink about our public services. Rosemary McLeod said quite recently in one of her articles that Pike River shows what happens when you tear away at the fabric of our public services. She said it's an ugly indictment of an ugly time. And like her, I doubt that even now we have learnt our lesson. And it's time we did learn that lesson. This bill tells me that the government hasn't. It is time for a rethink. I encourage the government to go back to the drawing board, to listen to the experts, those people who deliver our public services to us every day and who know better than anyone else how to deliver better public services.
I call the Honourable Member Paul Gold.